Hi again, I'm Mark McMillian. I found 3 articles from my website that are about basically what could be called miracles that I experienced in my travels around Europe, where I lived for a large portion of my adult life. The first article is called Hearty Faith, and it can be found on my website, markmcmillian.com. It's about a time in my 20s when I was living in Scandinavia. Foolhardy faith. Some of the things I've done as a missionary would be seen by some as virtually foolish. I wrote about It's a Gun, Isn't It? And how the Lord protected me and my friend from 5 drunken East European miners in our train car on a Saturday night. But we were traveling on a mission for the Lord, trying to go forward for Him. I could tell you of another time, perhaps more miraculous, while also probably more of a testimony of my youthful zeal, but without wisdom, which the Lord forgave and seemingly blessed anyway. I'd been married a little over a year, and my Norwegian wife and I were desperate to leave Stockholm, Sweden, where our first son had been born, and to somehow get ourselves to Vienna, Austria, where we both felt strongly that God was leading us. We felt called to the then communist lands of Eastern Europe, and to get ahead of the story a little, we did ultimately get to Vienna and had nearly 6 wonderful years there as we aimed, with other young missionaries back then, to reach the bedarkened people behind the Iron Curtain, as it was called then. But before we ever got there, I'll tell you of a story of God's infinite mercy and provision in spite of our zealous inexperience and almost foolhardy attempts to obey Him and go forward. It was barely spring in Stockholm, Sweden. My wife and I were desperate to move on from there towards what we hoped would be an open door to Vienna, Austria, almost 1,800 kilometers, 1,100 miles to the south. Our first move was to get ourselves back over to Norway, my wife's home country. We believed in living by faith, that is, trusting God to supply all our needs according to His riches and glory, Philippians 4, if we were seeking first His kingdom, Matthew 6. A solidly biblical belief, but certainly not one you'll hear taught in most churches. Here comes the hard part. You're going to think this is really out there. We were desperate and believed the Lord wanted us to go forward in our faith and obedience to Him. We had very little money at that time, so we decided to hitchhike from Stockholm to Oslo, Norway in early spring. This was somewhat more normal back then, not as dangerous as it is nowadays, and somewhat more acceptable. Still, we had our 2-month-old son with us, so it was pretty close to foolhardy. And it's not like there's some 500-kilometer, 300-mile superhighway between Stockholm and Oslo. The first evening, my former wife and I were at a highway rest stop, not actually too far from Stockholm. We made very little progress in hitchhiking, had virtually no money, and were eating a plate of French fries, praying together, reading our Bibles together, and were pretty desperate. To make a long story short, we saw a man looking at us from across the restaurant who seemed to be a truck driver. As he left to go out to his truck, my wife went out to talk to him and ask if he was driving to Norway to see if we could get a ride. I didn't speak the language there at the time. The man was already in his truck by the time my wife got there. He said that no, he wasn't driving to Oslo, but then he said, "Are you guys Christians?" Perhaps that was slightly more normal back then in that part of the world than it is now, but still, it was a very unusual question to have a stranger ask in Sweden. He'd seen us praying and reading our Bibles in the restaurant. So my wife said that we were, and he asked, "Well, do you need help?" She explained our situation, and he then helped with a generous donation. This made it possible for us to have a normal meal there, as well as to pay for a room to stay in at an adjoining motel overnight. The next day, we were able to hitchhike in fits and starts across Sweden to Norway and Oslo to friends and loved ones where we grew in the Lord in those early years of our faith. But it took another 3 years of travails in Scandinavia before we finally made it to Vienna. They say it takes an impossible situation for God to do a miracle. For us, that was one of the most outstanding and appreciated miracles we ever experienced. Perhaps it was foolhardy for us to step out on the water, see Matthew 14, like that with a young baby. But the Lord somehow forgave and overlooked our naivety and lack of wisdom, and saw instead our desire to go forward for Him. Are you young in the Lord? Are you desperate to follow your faith and what you believe God is calling you to do? I would certainly say try to have wisdom in whatever you do. Wisdom is the principal thing. But also, if God has given you the faith to follow Him and trust that He will provide and supply, I can tell you that God did that for me in spite of my indiscretions and being pretty much a fool for Christ. Your best bet is to truly follow Him, no matter how crazy it may seem. If it's truly of Him, He'll reach out His hand and get you across to the other side, no matter what outlandish way He has to do it, like He did for me, my wife, and my little boy so many years ago. God bless you. Nearly 20 years after that experience in Scandinavia, I was living in Eastern Europe after the fall of communism. This next article, It's a Gun, Isn't It?, is about a time where the Lord miraculously protected my friend and I through what could have been our violent deaths. It's a gun, isn't it? I was on an overnight train from Budapest, Hungary, to another Eastern European capital in the 1990s. With me was a young French sister in the Lord who was on her way to her new mission field. It was like a time of high summer in the spiritual sowing and reaping of that part of the world, after the fall of communism made it possible for those people to reach out to the Lord in a way impossible in the past. All was well until late in the evening after we'd crossed the border. There had only been the two of us in our train compartment until 5 young guys in their 20s came almost stumbling into our part of the train. It was Saturday evening, they were drunk, and to them we looked like some fun. Immediately they began to take a liking to my French companion. Meanwhile, sort of the ringleader sat down very close to me and rather intently, but somewhat lightheartedly, asked me some questions. All the while they were knocking back vodka or brandy, a common thing people do there to help them sleep on trains overnight. I should mention that I was actually carrying a somewhat large amount of money on me. This had been given to me as a gift to pass on to a missionary family in the country I was on my way to. I had this in a money pouch underneath my sports coat. We were all sitting close together, and I guess this ringleader guy noticed it. He suddenly put his hand right on my jacket where underneath the money pouch was and said, "What's that?" It was actually rather a tense moment for me. I was outnumbered 5-1. These guys were younger than me. I was in their country. I had a woman with me that they liked. They were drunk, and it wasn't like I could just phone 911 or get any help. The train conductor couldn't care less, and basically it was quickly developing into a dangerous situation. It would not have been too terribly unusual if they decided to rob me and throw me off the train while they had their way with my friend. So when he asked me, "What's that?" I said, "Oh, some papers." Hey, telling the truth, right? He looked at me hard and long and said, "It's a gun, isn't it?" I paused, looked back steadily at him and said, "No, it's not a gun." He kept looking at me silently. I mean, there he was right next to me, his hand on a large amount of money just underneath my sports coat. Next, he went out of the train cabin, out into the hallway with some of his buddies. I could see them talking together and then looking back at me from time to time. I continued to keep looking at them, but also I was staying relaxed. It certainly seemed like they were sizing up this situation and deciding whether to attack me and my friend or not. One thing working in our favor, in the physical at least, was that it was getting later and later and they were progressively getting drunker and drunker. I guess you could say the end of the story was that they didn't attack us. The ringleader was convinced I was carrying a gun under my coat and that I was just being coy about it. So gradually they dozed off to sleep, and after a long while my friend and I did the same. "Mark, that's not a miracle. You were just lucky." Say what you want, it sure felt like a major miracle. The Lord somehow tricked that guy into thinking I had a gun when actually his hand was on a large amount of cash in my money pouch underneath my jacket. It could also be said that we didn't exactly really heed the Lord's admonition to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. Matthew 10. We were doing the harmless thing okay, but we sure weren't being wise as serpents. And I've never made a border crossing like that again if I was ever carrying anything valuable. Another major thing was that we weren't just tourists traveling around seeing the sights. We were on a mission for the Lord, and we were under His protection as we went forward for Him. So it was like that verse, "The Lord shall fight for you, and you shall hold your peace," Exodus 14. Or the verse, You shall not need to fight in this battle. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord with you. 2 Chronicles 20. And sometimes, even when we're doing something that turns out to not really be truly the wisest and safest way to do something, if we're doing it sincerely in obedience to Him, He can get us out of what could be really serious trouble, like He did for us that night. It reminds me of some verses that I claimed way back before I ever left the States for the first time to go abroad for Him many years ago. When they were but a few men in number, yea, very few, and strangers in it, when they went from one nation to another, from one kingdom to another people, He suffered no man to do them wrong. Yea, He reproved kings for their sake, saying, Touch not mine anointed, and do my prophets no harm. Psalm 105. This last article is called 1 a.m. in Sophia, Bulgaria. It's about a time around 8 years ago when I was traveling from Romania to Bulgaria and ended up being stranded and alone in the main bus station there in the middle of the night. 1 a.m. in Sophia, Bulgaria. My bus was delayed on the border, so I didn't get into Sophia, Bulgaria till after midnight. I was expecting my friends to meet me at the bus station. But as I looked around the nearly empty station, I had a bad feeling about how I'd not really made sure to completely be definite that they'd meet me there. I tried to phone them from the station, but my roaming service on my phone was not connecting, so I couldn't get through. Things were getting bleak pretty quickly, and it didn't immediately get better. There were some ominous-looking taxi drivers hanging around who wanted to drive me someplace, but I didn't know where that would be. I asked someone at a food stall that was still open if they could phone my friends, but they didn't speak English. I was rapidly realizing that I was in a real fix and a potentially dangerous situation. There were 3 young guys standing around at the food stand in the bus station. I say young, I guess they were around 19. They weren't grown men, but they weren't really kids. They heard me speaking English, and they said they could phone my friends on their phone. They did, but there was no answer. I noticed that they were friendly, willing to talk, and be helpful. So I explained to them what had happened and took the step of faith to ask them if they knew of any hotels in the area. It was past 1 a.m., and it was looking like a hotel was about the only alternative, as I was not getting through to my friends, and it was getting really late. The 3 young Bulgarians said they knew some hotels in the area and could take me there. Needless to say, I was sure sending up some prayers during all this. The thought did cross my mind several times that I probably looked pretty vulnerable to any late-night denizens of the deep who were looking for some soft target and easy pickings. As we went out to their car, I'll admit I thought about how these guys could just drive me off somewhere to kill me and rob whatever I had with me. But I was checking in with the Lord and also trying to get the witness of the Spirit on the whole thing. And I was not getting any checks in the Spirit against the way things were going. We started driving around downtown Sophia and soon found a hotel that was nicer than I was figuring to stay in. 2 of them went in to check the price, and it sounded surprisingly low to me, but they wanted to see if they could find something for less. At length, after trying a few other places, I told them that the nice hotel they checked out would be fine. I was also telling them how much I appreciated their help, that I'd come to Bulgaria to speak in churches, and that I prayed that God would bless them for their helping. They just continued to be kind-hearted good guys, for lack of a better term. I checked into the hotel with their help and was finally up in my room for the night when the phone rang in my room. It was my friends in Sophia, who I'd been trying to reach earlier that night from the station. They had gotten the call from the young men and phoned the number back. Those guys told my friend where I was, so my friend got in contact with me. End of story, I guess. But I can tell you I was mighty glad to be safely in a hotel at that hour of the night in a foreign city where I didn't speak the language and knew hardly anyone. I was very aware that it all could have gone much worse, and it really stood out to me that those 3 young men were there at the bus station at that time and were able and willing to help me. I certainly saw it as the Lord's love and hand getting me through a potentially very dangerous situation. It reminded me of the verse, "Underneath are the everlasting arms," Deuteronomy 33. I failed to be diligent in making sure of my contact and meeting with my friends in Sophia. But in spite of my failure, the Lord came to the rescue in bringing along those 3 young men to help me. It reminded me of another time I wrote about in the blog post, God's Little Miracles. where a similar but even more supernatural thing happened to me late one night in Austin, Texas. Some folks will say, this is all chance. That's certainly how I used to look at it in the past. In fact, one time before I was a Christian, I blurted out one day to my friends like it was a revelation, God is chance. And the Lord proceeded to get a good deal of mileage out of my saying that. I wrote about that in the blog post, God is Chance. I'm just really thankful that the Lord was there to rescue me that night in Sophia. It could seem like a little thing or a coincidence that those young men were there and helped. For me, I recognize that it was again the Lord's mercy on my life. I'm so thankful for that. I do hope that you find these things I'm recounting here to be encouraging and faith-building. Sometimes our faith has to be tested, and that's certainly how it was for me through these experiences. If any of this strikes a chord with you, I'd be glad to hear your reaction or response. This is sort of a new direction for me to be doing audio recordings like this, and I'd be glad to hear any feedback you have to what I've been sharing here. I'm just so thankful for this chance to tell you about these things the Lord has done in my life. All the best to you, your friend, Mark.